What do you think of when you hear the word safeguarding? Tedious paperwork with health and safety gone mad? Scandals involving priests and choir boys and people like Jimmy Savile? How did they get away with it for so long? Perhaps the word safeguarding makes you think of the scandals of cover-ups that made those other scandals even worse. Or does the word safeguarding make you think of God's love expressed through care for the vulnerable? Because that's what this sermon series is aiming at, helping us to recognise that far from being a red tape tick box exercise, safeguarding is one of the ways that we continue Jesus' ministry of raising up the vulnerable and caring for the weak. And to do that takes compassion. It involves listening. It requires transparency in all of our practices. When we look at it like that, it's not hard to see how safeguarding is an expression of the protective Father heart of God. Stephen spoke about this a few weeks ago, and he pointed out loads of places in the Bible where God talks about himself as a safeguarding shepherd protecting his people. So as God's church, doing God's work, how do we put that into practice here at church? Well, one way is by running our groups in ways that protect people from being exploited in any way, like always having 2 leaders in a children's group, like keeping good records. For example, here at Christchurch, we use Church Suite database to manage the rotas. So if a parent expressed concern about something that had happened in a children's group or anywhere else, then the people in the church office could look at Church Suite and they can easily see who was on the rota that day and which children were there. And those structures make people feel safe because they can see that the leaders are accountable to each other and to the church leaders. But safeguarding is not only about keeping children and vulnerable people safe, it's also about keeping people safe from temptation. For example, if someone's collecting money, but no records are kept, then there's no transparency or accountability. And for the wrong person, that could be a very tempting situation. Proper accountability helps to keep temptation at bay and keeps leaders safe, as well as vulnerable people. And all of these things are just good practice nowadays. Some of them are the law. But whether they are or not, as a caring and inclusive church, we would want to do them anyway. What it takes is love and compassion. But this sermon is about wisdom, truth, and justice in safeguarding. It's only when we face up to the truth about human nature, and perhaps the truth about our own past as a community, that these precautions can come from the heart. It's only when we realise that cutting corners on these safeguarding practices can make certain people feel uncomfortable or even unsafe that we start to see them as justice issues. And it's when we allow our thinking to be shaped by that truth and that justice that we're able to act wisely. So what is the place of truth in safeguarding? Well, we can be guided by our reading here, the second reading. The first principle is not to be scared to tell the truth. Expose everything to the light. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It's shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that's illuminated becomes a light. It's important to speak up if we see something suspicious, just like we're always being told to do on the trains. If you see something suspicious, tell a member of staff. Yes, we might well feel reluctant to mention things that have happened, either to us or to someone else. And it might feel wrong or disloyal to go into detail, but this reluctance must not be at the expense of truth. Ephesians says that talking about the bad things that have been done shines a light on them, and we can take courage from that. I recently watched a documentary on YouTube about Mike Pilavachi, and Tim mentioned him in his sermon a couple of weeks ago. Mike Pilavachi founded and led the charismatic youth group movement called Soul Survivor. And in October last year, he was found guilty of a lot of emotional abuses as well as some physical abuse. He got away with it for many years, and he ruined the lives of over 150 teenagers and young adults with psychological manipulation and mental torture. Why did none of his victims speak up in all those years? Why did they keep the truth hidden? Well, there was the imbalance of power. They were young people, often from unstable backgrounds, and he was a world-famous spiritual leader. Here he is with our Archbishop Justin Welby and Bishop Michael Curry, the one who preached at Prince Harry and Meghan's wedding. The poor victims were totally in awe of Mike Pilavachi, as was everyone else. Although, of course, they're both precious to God, whether you're a world-famous spiritual leader or a teenager with a troubled past, you're just as precious to God. But those teenagers longed for Mike's approval at the same time as he was making them suffer. That was the success of his manipulation. But another reason that the documentary gave was that nobody wanted to disrupt the wonderful spiritual work that was Soul Survivor. It was a huge success, but it was built on this unhealthy structure because it all rested on this one highly respected and powerful leader who had no accountability. And this is an example of what Stephen was talking about in his sermon 3 weeks ago. We're not here to safeguard the church. We're here to safeguard its people. It's our job to tell the truth, even if we do fear that it will bring disaster. God wants us to do the right thing and leave the consequences to him. If that means speaking unwelcome truths about a powerful person, then that's what we must do. And it's up to God how he uses that act of faithfulness in the wider community. We can't control that, and we shouldn't try. We should just shine a light on the truth and believe people when they tell us their truth. And it's only once that's happened that anything can be dealt with any kind of justice, and that justice can be seen to be done. If a situation is dealt with wisely, it will bring light into that dark experience, and it will shine like a beacon to the rest of the world to say that we don't tolerate abuse, and we'll work on the side of the powerless to bring about justice. If the church would do that, it could be at the forefront of good practice in safeguarding, rather than being best known for its cover-ups. As Peter puts it in 1 Peter 2, verse 12, we want the world to see the way that we put things right, and that should inspire them to glorify God. The way things are at the moment, we're more criticised for failing the victims of abuse than we are for the abuse itself. As Peter goes on to say in verse 16, live as free people, but don't use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. We should never use the power we have to cover up things that should be dealt with. So in safeguarding, the church has two responsibilities. Firstly, prevention. The responsibility to operate in such a way that the opportunities for abuse are really small, or as small as we can make them. Like a lighthouse that shows where the rocks are. Keep away from this, it's risky. In certain circumstances it might be fine, but if anything does go wrong, this is where it's most likely to happen. By sticking to the proper procedures and safeguarding policies, we make people feel secure and confident when they take part in our groups and activities. So here's an example of that in practice. There was a charity that worked with immigrants in London. The charity workers got to know some of the clients quite well, and one woman started going out with one of the charity's clients, a slightly older man. This is a safeguarding issue, so as soon as it happened, the charity stopped the woman from working in that role. They moved her to another section. Was that harsh? Was it racist? No, it's preventative. The issue is the difference in power. The charity's clients are vulnerable, newly arrived in this country, not fluent in English, and they don't know their way around the system. So although they're consenting adults, It could be easy for an unscrupulous person to take advantage of one of them. On the other hand, from the man's point of view, if he's recently arrived in a new country and trying to get established, what better way than to latch onto a woman who can give him a leg up and maybe even a comfortable place to live? If that woman was a bit needy and maybe got issues of her own, she could easily be manipulated for all sorts of reasons. But they're consenting adults, but they love each other. Yes, but the truth is more than that. The truth is the difference in power. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how either of them could use that relationship. But by acting swiftly to remove the power difference, the charity was protecting both the woman and the man. Facing the truth of what could happen enabled the charity to act justly and wisely before anything did happen. And it sends a message to outsiders that they care enough about their staff and their clients that they won't tolerate anyone being put in a risky situation. We can all enable people to feel safe by making sure we follow the safeguarding policies that we have here. The principles are on the church website with a link to the diocese's Safe Church policy, which is full of information about how to make a church a safe place for everyone. And we can be alert to things that might make someone feel uncomfortable or put someone in a vulnerable position or a compromising situation. It's our responsibility to be alert and think of these things on behalf of vulnerable people. We can't necessarily expect them to speak up for themselves, especially if they're children. Because even if we ask someone if they're okay with, say, cutting a corner in some way, they might well say, yes, it's fine, because they don't want to make a fuss, or they don't fully appreciate their own vulnerability. We have to think for others. That's why it's called safeguarding. We individually and as a community guard the safety of everyone in our community and everyone who visits our community. That's how we shine a light which glorifies God. So our first responsibility is prevention, and our second responsibility is response. It's the responsibility of all of us to respond with compassion and wisdom to any safeguarding event. That means facing the truth and using the truth to bring anything untoward out into the light, and then not being afraid to pursue justice. That might mean speaking up about our own experience or listening to someone else's experience and believing them. The trouble is that we'd all much rather these things didn't happen. And because of that, the truth can be sacrificed for the sake of wishful thinking. So we might decide not to believe someone because of wishful thinking that was not really the case. Something happened to me once, not at church, which when I look back on it, I can see that's what's happened. Wishful thinking overcame the truth. It was when I was a student, before the days of mobile phones. So one evening, I went out to make a phone call from the phone box down the road. I finished my call, and I started opening the door to come out, and there was a man waiting outside. And as I did that, he pushed past me, and he pushed himself into the doorway, and he put his hand on my waist. And instinctively, I just yelled at him as loud as I could, "Go away, get away, leave me alone." Unfortunately, he stepped back. He apologised and said that he didn't mean to scare me. He just wanted to ask me for some change for the phone. I felt a bit silly, and I remember shakily looking in my purse for 10p to give him. I even apologised to him for the misunderstanding, and I went back home. It was only later that I could see the situation objectively, and I realised that obviously he wasn't asking for change. That was his cover-up. But I'd started to believe him because of wishful thinking. I wanted to normalise what had happened. It didn't occur to me to report the incident to anyone. The truth was covered up and justice wasn't done. Imagine if I'd kept a firm grip on the truth and I'd reported him to the police. If justice ran its full course, he might have got help and other women might have been protected. But that's how grooming works. A would-be abuser prepares the ground by working their way into a position of trust, so that when they do make a move, everyone says, "Oh, they're such a good person. That can't be true. It's a misunderstanding." Wishful thinking makes us unwilling to believe the victim's account. Wishful thinking makes us turn a blind eye to the little clues and red flags that we half noticed all along. Wishful thinking makes us ignore those gut feelings. But that's why it's important to tell people and to keep records. Supposing that man I met at the telephone box had been someone we all knew. Or supposing I'd told my housemates what had happened. A, they could have been more watchful, and B, I might have found out that I wasn't the only one. Record keeping would have shown if he was a repeat offender. Speaking out might have enabled something to be done. So that's why we have a responsibility in church to make it easy for people to report something that they're worried about in a safe way. That's why at Christchurch we have a phone number in all the loos so that people can ring that number to report anything that they need to. In schools they have a way of raising the smallest concerns about a child. They may turn out to be just a one-off that means nothing, but if those small concerns start to show a consistent pattern, it becomes clear that a child needs help or might even need rescuing. We as a church keep records of any worrying incidents, so over time it could be that a pattern might start to emerge, a picture might be revealed. It would show up if there was somebody that we needed to protect people from, or it might show that some simple precautions are needed, in my case, going to the phone box in pairs, so that we can get rid of the conditions that enable those worrying things to happen. If the conditions are right, then worrying things can't take place. Information is power. So speaking the truth and keeping records about anything uncomfortable will give us the power to protect people from anything serious happening. And that's a collective act of justice. But of course, none of this is easy. It's a painful and sensitive subject, prone to wishful thinking and not rocking the boat. If we're going to act justly for the powerless, then like King Solomon in our first reading, the very first thing we must do is pray for wisdom. And the second thing we must do is ask for the courage to speak the truth.